Okay, First Kings chapter 4, continuing on to understand Solomon as he is establishing himself as ruler in Egypt. In this chapter, we're not going to read every verse all the way through uh, because Solomon is reorganizing the government and reorganizing how he rules as king. So we want to learn a little bit more about these changes, but we don't necessarily need to read every single one of the things that are in this section. So we're going to go over a couple of points in this chapter just so we can understand what this chapter is about, basically. So, verse 1, so King Solomon was king over all Israel. So that establishes him. He's the king of the whole place, basically. And these were the princes which he had. So now they're going to go into talk about the princes and their duties and responsibilities as well. I have a quote here I wanted to read that just will probably make more sense for us. This is out of Great People of the Bible and How They Lived. So it says here, upon his ascension to the throne, Solomon made the first of several administrative changes. He created 3 new offices in his cabinet. David had governed his new empire almost single-handedly, needing only a commanding general, a chief scribe, and a few secretaries. To this basic staff, Solomon added Ahishar, who was in charge of the palace. He would serve as prime minister, second only to Solomon in power. So what we're looking at here, David ruled. Okay, we had King David. He had a general over his army, and he had a few assistants to assist him in his work and what he was doing. Didn't have much more than that. It was a pretty unified situation around him, which makes sense. If you think about it, the time of King David and with Joshua and all these guys, with even Saul and them, they went from judges. They went from having a prophet ruler, basically, to judges to judge them. And then they went to having a king because the people wanted a king. Remember, Samuel's like, you really don't want to do this. They're like, no, we would like to have a king. So Samuel warned them about having a king, and then Saul was brought up. And so then, they had to try to use the king to rally the people together. So having a charismatic king, somebody who could pull all the tribes together and unify them, was important. Now that they're coming together, they kind of united somewhat under David. They don't necessarily need to have that as much. So Solomon's is realizing, hey, the people have grown exponentially. We've got a much larger group of people than we used to because of the prosperity of Israel. So we need to change how we're doing things to administer the government better. So now he's pulling in people to help do things for the government because he's not going to do it all himself, basically. So to this basic staff, Solomon added Ahishar, who is in charge of the palace. He would serve as prime minister, second only to Solomon in power. Adoniram was named the chief of forced labor, for Solomon had a tremendous building program in mind and no way to begin it without a steady supply of workers. Remember, he wanted to build a bigger palace for himself. He wanted to build a temple to God, a permanent temple, so they didn't have to use the older tabernacle, which is probably falling into disrepair somewhat. So over the years, just wasn't probably kept up as much. So he wanted a permanent temple to God, and he wanted to fortify the city walls, if you remember from the previous chapter. So he said Adoniram would supervise both foreign slave laborers, aka the descendants of those people who had survived the Israelite conquest, and a newly organized conscripted labor force of Israelites who served 1 out of every 3 months. So as an Israelite, you served in the king's labor pool 1 month out of every 3 months, basically. So you rotated taking care of your family's responsibilities, working for the king, kind of a thing, kind of a tax on labor, basically. In addition, Azariah, the son of Nathan, was over the officers or provincial governors of the 12 districts of Israel. So up to now, the government of Israel, even under Saul and David, had never been controlled by an administration as we know it, but rather by a patriarchal or charismatic leader who ruled largely by personal magnetism and inspiration from the Lord. Such leadership had been necessary to unite the 12 independent and often quarrelsome tribes during the military conquest of Canaan. But now Israel was at peace and her territory was greatly enlarged. The nation sorely needed a more efficient method of government. So Solomon divided Israel into 12 administrative districts, all comparatively equal in population and resources. To accommodate the new territory, the arbitrary divisions ignored the old tribal boundaries, and for all practical purposes, the tribal distinctions were abandoned, except for temple duties and genealogies. So remember they were used to be literally divided into the 12 tribes, the descendants of the 12 sons of Joseph, or Jacob, excuse me, Joseph being one of them. But over the years, some tribes had grown and others had shrank. Remember, Benjamin nearly got completely wiped out in that little civil war between Judah and Benjamin. And so they were a small tribe. They didn't do so well, but other tribes thrived and did amazingly well. So the tribes were different. But at this point, the distinctions in tribes, there was, I'm sure, intermarriages and other things that were happening. And so they didn't really matter as much to the people. So they decided, okay, for genealogies, we'll keep it. For temple duties, we'll keep it. But as far as the government's concerned, we're going to break you into equal districts, basically. Solomon assigned one officer to head each district. All of them were responsible to Azariah. The 12 officers were in charge of raising provisions for the king's household. Each district supplied food for 1 month of every year. The officers in turn imposed the burden of providing food on the farmers and shepherds, and quite a burden it was. The provision needed for 1 day by Solomon's court was 30 cores of fine flour, 188 bushels of fine flour, 60 cores of meal, which is about 370 bushels, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides harts, gazelles, which are deer, roebucks, and fatted fowl, and those offices let nothing be lacking. Barley also and straw for the horses and swift steeds they brought to the palace where it was required, each according to his charge. And this was only part of the taxation. So not only were they supposed to give 1 month out of 3 to labor for the king's projects, but they had to give every out of a year, they had to donate a whole month's worth of extra food to the king. Holy cow. This is crazy. This is a lot of taxation. This isn't the end of it. There's a lot. Solomon put some serious taxes on the people. It makes it a little grievous for him, which was exactly what Samuel warned the people about when he told them, if you get a king, he's going to impose a lot of taxes on you and make your life hard. And he's going to also take your sons and send them to war, and they're all going to die, which is exactly what happened under Saul. He sent the sons out to die. There's a lot of death under King David. Now Solomon is taxing the people a lot. So Samuel's prophecy did come true. So like it says, we're not going to necessarily go over all this. You can look at all these names, go through all these to see, here's who got this job, here's who's over this tribe, here's who over this tribe, here's how all this worked out. And we can see here, let's see. Verse 20, Judah and Israel were many as the sand which is by the sea, in multitude, eating and drinking and making merry. Solomon reigned over all kingdoms from the river unto the land of the Philistines and unto the border of Egypt. They brought presents and served Solomon all the days of his life. So in Adam Clarke's The Holy Bible with a commentary and critical notes, he says the meaning of this verse appears to be that Solomon reigned over all the provinces from the river Euphrates to the land of the Philistines, even to the frontiers of Egypt. The Euphrates was on the east of Solomon's dominions. The Philistines were westward on the Mediterranean Sea, and Egypt was on the south. Solomon had therefore as tributaries the kingdoms of Syria, Damascus, Moab, and Ammon, which lay between the Euphrates and the Mediterranean. So these were places outside of the nation of Israel that he basically accepted them as provinces for his kingdom, basically. So they were part of his kingdom, and so they gave him tributes. They paid tribute to him, basically. And then it goes into the dominion he has and the things they had to provide his kingdom with. One thing that's interesting is verse 29, and God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding exceeding much, and largeness of heart, even as the sand that is on the seashore. And Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the children of the east country and all the wisdom of Egypt. So who is this, the children of the east country? Well, Dumelo in his commentary says the term is applied in Jeremiah 49:28 as well to the Arab tribes dwelling at Kedar, and probably describes generally the inhabitants of the Syrian desert. So they were other people there that were very wise, but Solomon's wisdom exceeded their wisdom as well, which was prophesied basically. And then it goes on in verse 31, he was wiser than all men, and names a bunch of men from different nations around that he was wiser than. Verse 32, he spake 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spake of trees, from the cedar tree that is in Lebanon, even to the hyssop that springeth out of the wall. He spake also of beasts and fowls, of creeping things and fishes. There came of all people to hear the wisdom of Solomon from all kings of the earth, which had heard of his wisdom, which was prophesied that all the kings would come to him. He would be wiser than everybody else, basically, and they were amazed at the wisdom he had. Now, we know a lot of the Proverbs came from Solomon. He wrote those. He probably didn't write all of them, but there's a bunch there, and probably a ton more that have been lost to history. We do know there's a book, the Songs of Solomon, which are songs that Solomon wrote, kind of love letters, if you will, to his wives and concubines. Joseph Smith said it's probably the most uninspired part of the whole Bible is the Songs of Solomon. There's not really redeeming value in them as far as gospel truths and ideas. But those are probably, again, that's a small piece of all the stuff that Solomon wrote. So we don't have the complete volumes of what Solomon had put together, basically. But those are where a lot of Proverbs and came from Solomon, as well as the Songs of Solomon too. And they kind of reference that here a little bit as well. But those are kind of the writings that they're referencing basically in those scriptures. So let's jump to the next chapter to learn more about Solomon's great kingdom.